We'll give it just another minute here in case there's anybody joining a little later. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and kick us off. Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Emily Thompson. I am the Deputy Director of the Coalition to Protect America's National Parks. Thank you for joining us today for a look at our national parks, our public lands, appropriations, and a potential government shutdown on the horizon. So this webinar will be recorded. You'll be able to view it afterwards on our website if you need to leave or would like to share it. It should last about 45 minutes to an hour, and we will leave some time for questions at the end. So if you do have any questions, feel free to type it into the question and answer box, and we'll get to those at the end of the conversation. The Coalition to Protect America's National Parks is a nonprofit organization representing over 2,500 current, former, and retired National Park Service employees and volunteers. We like to say we have 45,000 collective years of experience managing and stewarding our national parks. We're strong advocates for the 30 by 30 initiative, something we've been talking about with some frequency. And we're very supportive of the goal to protect 30% of U.S. lands and waters by 2030. We're also strong advocates for the additional protection of public lands and support the creation of national monuments such as Aviquame, Kastner Range, Camp Hale, Continental Divide, and a number of others. We've had some victories in the last year and look forward to more celebration to come, hopefully in the near future. So when we talk about conservation, though, we're not just talking about protecting additional lands that are not yet fully protected. We're also talking about taking care of the lands that are already in our protection. And this means pushing for adequate and additional funding for our national parks. We all know, or many of us know at least, that national parks have been pretty chronically underfunded. Parks are trying to manage an increase in visitation despite inadequate operating budgets and staff reductions in parks and program offices that support the work of the parks. These reductions have resulted in fewer programs, shortened hours of operation, sometimes a decline in visitor experience, and even degradation of natural and cultural resources. Between FY 2011 and FY 2020, the Park Service lost almost 19% of its operating staff capacity. We added 30 park units and other authorized sites to the system, and annual visitation grew by 30 million. So these are good things in some ways. We protected more sites. That's something to celebrate. More people want to come to the parks. But the problem is there's not enough staff to handle the increase in visitation, and there's not enough funding to help address that. The National Park Service needs permanent funding increases to support park operations and ensure that fixed costs are addressed, and also to ensure that Park Service staff capacity is there, so we can address the needs and impacts of this increasing visitation on both visitor experience, visitor safety, employee safety, and the protection of park resources. In addition to all of this, Park Service employee morale is low. Park employees are often overworked, trying to do more with less. We have a problem with housing. There's inadequate and a lack of housing in the system, and these all have major impacts. And then on top of all this, we have a looming government shutdown. The last shutdown that occurred in 2018-2019 under the previous administration, and it lasted over a month. It impacted employees and visitors who couldn't work, who couldn't visit the parks, and it impacted local economies. So in 2022, we had 312 million park visitors spend an estimated $23.9 billion in local gateway regions surrounding national parks. So imagine what a shutdown is going to do to that economy and those figures. It also impacted the protection of park resources. The previous shutdown was a partial shutdown, which means the parks were open, but there wasn't enough staff to help protect the resources. We did send in teams of coalition members to take survey of the impacts, and this is something we're going to talk a little bit more about on this webinar. So we're concerned. We're concerned about the state of the Park Service and appropriations. We're concerned about proposed funding cuts in FY24. We're urging Congress for an eventual FY24 appropriations bill that does not cut public lands funding. And we're concerned about a shutdown. We're urging Congress to pass the continuing resolution to help keep our government open until Congress can pass spending bills that will invest in our parks and public lands. So we're here to speak to you today about these concerns and how a shutdown will impact the system. We are lucky enough to be joined by three amazing, wonderful coalition members and former park employees. We have Phil Francis with us, who was a former chair of the coalition. Phil served the Park Service for over 40 years at parks such as Shenandoah, Yosemite, Great Smoky Mountains, and retired as superintendent at the Blue Ridge Parkway. We're also joined by Sheridan Steele, an executive council member with 38 years of service in the National Park Service at parks such as Rocky Mountain and Cuyahoga Valley, who retired as superintendent at Acadia National Park. And also Cheryl Schreier, an executive council member with more than 40 years with the National Park Service. Cheryl worked at 10 different park units for numerous park offices and programs and retired as superintendent of Mount Rushmore. These are all folks who have extensive experience working with the parks, unfortunately have seen a number of government shutdowns, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to them. So Phil, if you want to kick off the conversation, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Emily. And thanks to all of you who are tuning in to this webinar. As Yogi Berra once said, it's deja vu all over again. Or as President Reagan once said, here we go again. But, it's really a difficult time, I think, for our employees and our communities, our visitors. Our communities are so dependent upon visitors to come to help bolster their economies. Our visitors are planning a trip in all likelihood, or may have planned a trip, and now the ability to visit their favorite national park may be in jeopardy. And certainly people who in the local economies need the busy time of year to maybe make the difference between being in the red or being in the black with regard to their financials at the end of the year. So we certainly hope that the Congress will pass a budget. We've been following this very closely. Let me also mention our volunteers. I read this today and I couldn't believe it. The Park Service has 300,000 volunteers, to help support our employees and other people who contribute to the success of the park and meeting its mission. I'm sure they're wondering what's going to happen too. Should they plan on being there and reporting to the park or not? I don't know. We've got concession operations that I think last year grossed $1 billion, and created 25,000 jobs. So are they going to close or not? We don't know. But anybody that's run a business is very aware that they need to have more certainty so that they can run their business effectively and efficiently and serve the visitors well. I think that the local communities surrounding the parks create, I just read this and it's amazing, 378,000 jobs. That's a bunch. And it's really critical. I know here in the Smokies where I am right now, or the Blue Ridge Parkway, we're not far away, or Shenandoah. This time of year is really one of the highlights and one of the most profitable times for these businesses. And the demand is great because the parks are so beautiful at this time of year that people want to come and experience the parks and enjoy the parks. And they may face, I hope not, a gate that closes the park. And if the gate is open, and we need to have full staffing, we need to have the full complement of people to help protect the parks and serve the park visitors. When back in 2018, things weren't so good. There were resource damage all over our country. I remember in Joshua Tree, for example, a Joshua tree was killed. And you may remember, if you think about it, there was a garbage can and human feces located right next door to it. And so when people aren't available to to do the maintenance, to provide the special services that our park rangers and interpreters provide and our maintenance people perform, it creates real problems. And so it's unnecessary. And we think certainly that the Congress has got one of their main jobs is to pass a budget. And I hope they will find a way to pass it on time so that so there won't be these impacts, and that these special places can be visited and people will enjoy them.
All right. Thank you, Phil.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Sheridan to get his thoughts, and we'll move on.
Thank you, Emily and Phil. I thought I would just give you a good example of what a shutdown means on the ground. So I was deputy superintendent of Rocky Mountain National Park when it was shut down for the first time. And then, of course, I was superintendent of Acadia National Park for many years during another shutdown. And let me tell you a little bit about Acadia first. It's one of the smallest national parks in the system, but it's also one of the most visited. Visitation has gone up 75% since 2010, and yet the budget has gone down 8 to 10%, down 8 to 10%. That means fewer employees to deal with more visitors, and more visitors mean more work in terms of cleaning restrooms and emptying trash, maintaining the place, protecting resources, and providing information. And all of those functions suffer when the park is closed or operations are limited. For Acadia, the next few weeks are some of the busiest of the year. Why? Because of fall color that's spectacular in Maine, and also because the number of cruise ships visiting Bar Harbor is at its peak during the next few weeks. So this is a lot of people coming to Acadia expecting to have a normal operation and could be faced with very limited operations. And so when shutdowns occur, you end up with trash overflowing, restrooms closed, and therefore human waste in the bushes and along the trails. Visitors can't get orientation and including safety messages. Emergency response could be limited. So overall, it provides for a much degraded visitor experience or no visitor experience. It also provides for degradation of some of the natural and cultural resources that the parks are charged to protect. So vandalism, for instance, or just wear and tear that's not taken care of. So for parks like Acadia, there's another issue, and that is, so at Rocky Mountain National Park, where I said I was deputy superintendent, it's a big rectangle with 3 entrances and exits. Acadia National Park is a patchwork quilt of park units, areas, scattered around 60 islands and on the mainland in Maine. Although the primary piece, the biggest piece and most visited piece is on Mount Desert Island, which is connected by a bridge. But so the reality is you cannot close Acadia National Park. You could close Rocky Mountain with closing those 3 entrances, but Acadia cannot be closed fully. And that means people are going to be using it, whether it's closed or not. And it's going to present those problems and challenges that I mentioned in terms of maintenance, visitor experience, and resource protection. So one other thing I wanted to mention about that is that the staffing has been going down as the budget has gone down. And so the ability to serve these growing number of visitors is really impaired. And we're very concerned about that because it puts the resources that we're supposed to protect at risk, but it also puts visitors at risk because they don't get the information that they need for a safe and enjoyable visit. And all of this impacts employee morale, who have been stressed because there are fewer of them to serve more and more visitors. And yet the workload doesn't stop. It doesn't decline. It only goes up. So that morale is becoming a big issue, I think, in the national parks. So I wanted to kind of paint that picture of what it's like at Acadia National Park and also Rocky Mountain. And I look forward to having some questions and some conversation. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Sheridan. And then we will turn it over to Cheryl to do a brief overview, and then we can get into discussion and questions if we got it.
All right, thank you, Emily, and thank you for those who have tuned in to participate in the webinar today. My experiences with shutdowns range all the way back to 1996, but as a superintendent and as an acting superintendent back in 2013, I was at Cuyahoga Valley, and I remember very vividly that that was an instance where, just as Sheridan was referring to, it's a park in a very urban area and does not have gates to really close the park, and the trails remained open. Very difficult for employees to be able to enforce the laws and regulations, plus provide that very important visitor services. And while I was acting superintendent at Cuyahoga, my home park as superintendent was Mount Rushmore National Memorial. And of course, being here in the Black Hills of South Dakota, Mount Rushmore stands out as an icon, and for tourism in South Dakota, it is really the #1 tourism site. And at that time, it was very challenging when the state stepped in and said that they were going to fund Mount Rushmore and employees to keep the park open. A very different scenario. I think there were other parks that were presented with that scenario as well, I believe Grand Canyon. And that would make it very challenging to pay back the state of South Dakota, but that is what happened back in 2013. In the 2018-2019 shutdown, different administration, the governor at that time of South Dakota, Governor Dugard, had stated the state would not step in to keep facilities open at Mount Rushmore, because at that time it was agreed that the concession operations and Terra could remain open, but visitor centers would be closed. The parking facility at Mount Rushmore remained open because that was operated by the concessionaire. They could continue to collect fees, and they had a food and beverage operation, retail operation. So that was the main interface for visitors. And that was also the only restroom facilities that were open because we closed the main visitor center area restrooms for visitors. And so the challenges were immense. And the 35 days of having to shut down at that time, very difficult for morale of employees. I recall that several of our employees, they sought unemployment. Some people were afraid that they couldn't pay rent at their apartments or houses in the area. And I did make an attempt to contact each and every one of those employees. 35 days is a very long time, and to contact them to see how they were all doing. And there is a rift, if you will, for those employees that were working And those employees that were not working, that can also be a very difficult situation. And then not knowing for sure if you're going to be paid after the shutdown is over. And so those were some of the situations. One interesting aspect is because we could not spend any funding, the sculpture is normally lit at night. And so during the shutdown for those 35 days, people who enjoyed coming to Mount Rushmore to see the sculpture lit at night could not enjoy that aspect. And I think overall it was difficult. I was on site, but I was not heard nor seen. Stayed behind the curtain, if you will. And our law enforcement rangers had little interaction with visitors, tried to be able to answer questions, that type of thing, but it was certainly really challenging. And then with the other areas in the Black Hills, some of the parks were able to just close their gates, made it a little bit easier, but very difficult for visitors to know what parks were open, what parks were closed, what facilities were available. I think it's, as was already stated by certainly Phil and Sheridan, with already low morale in the National Park Service. This is just another, if you will, just another punch in the gut for the National Park Service employees who dedicate their lives to preserving these resources. October, very visible and very active tourism here in the Black Hills. We also have the fall colors here and many activities and events that occur. And also, I think one of the, especially with Western parks, it's also a time where hunting on the outskirts of parks, Forest Service lands, they have their challenges as well, and the concerns for poaching and those other illegal activities. And with Mount Rushmore being an icon park, certainly concerned about the security aspect of visitors being in areas that they are not allowed to be. And of course, those communities, the gateway communities, and the impact to our cooperating associations and other partners that they too have employees and had employees who had to find unemployment or find other jobs. So the hope is that Congress will certainly at least pass a CR, if not a complete spending bill for fiscal year 2024. So thank you for the opportunity to share a few of my anecdotes for past shutdowns in the National Park Service and the incredible impacts for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. We appreciate it. I mean, it's been very interesting to hear your different and vast experience at different parks in different parts of the country in different shutdown scenarios. I think, you know, clearly a shutdown is not ideal. And as Cheryl mentioned, you know, we will continue to urge Congress to pass a CR to avoid the scenario. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add one thing. You know, we talked about employee morale, and that's really, really, really important. One of the things that's happened, I mean, after 4 decades of all of us working, you know, back in the days when we started, there would be 100 to 1,000 applications for jobs. And today, the National Park Service is having difficulty attracting and retaining employees. And I can't help but think, you know, the use of our employees as pawns in a political game is part of the reason why people are reluctant to apply. And I can't prove that, but it seems to be true. Why come to work if you're going to be uncertain about, you know, your future? and whether or not there's enough budget. We've got over 3,000 vacant permanent positions in the National Park Service right now. If the Congress passes a flat budget, that means that there's going to be more vacancies than exist because the cost of doing business goes up and the funding remains the same. And so it's really important, I think, if you run a business, you want a high-performing, happy workforce committed to their jobs. And I think during the history of the Park Service, we have had some of the most committed employees of anybody anywhere. But I think some of that's eroding away. And I think one of the reasons, as I mentioned before, is because of this uncertainty and the lack of respect, I think, that is being paid to our government employees who really are dedicated, who really care about doing their jobs.
Another factor related to that, Phil, is that another major national park in the West that I won't name the superintendent, but he's a friend of mine. And he says that they have lines at the restrooms, they have lines at the bus stops, they have lines everywhere because of the tremendous increase in visitation. And yet the facilities and the infrastructure can't keep up and cleaning and everything else. And so they get a lot of complaints that they didn't used to get from visitors. And I think that begins to wear on employees too, when they're constantly dealing with things that they cannot control and really can affect. And so I think that's really tiring for folks.
Yeah, I know I've had people come into my office and they were used to performing at a certain standard and that their resources would be presented, the grass would be mowed, the buildings would be clean. And people, our employees were very prideful about that. And then when they're unable to perform at that same level, it's very disappointing to them.
Thanks. So if anyone attending has any questions or would like to bring up a topic for discussion, that's great. While we're waiting on that, I wanted to just ask you all, ideally, there's still time. Maybe this won't be an issue, but if there is a shutdown, can you talk a little bit about not just the immediate impacts, but what are the long-term impacts? Like, how does this affect things like hiring or contracting, research projects? What have you seen during your time with the Park Service?
Well, I think ongoing science in parks sometimes is affected by a shutdown or is stalled, or they can't get the information on a regular basis that they normally would get. So I think resource management and science is affected for sure. I think long-term also, if you're not maintaining your facilities on a regular basis, you get behind further, and then it's hard to catch up. So, long-term, there are additional impacts, I think, from a shutdown.
And I would also add.
Go ahead, Cheryl.
I would also add, if you have a major project and you have contractors who are on site, they have to demob that project, and then the increase in the cost of the project overall is a burden for the National Park Service, rather than using some of those funds for other projects. And then, of course, a delay in a project, whether it be construction, a rehabilitation project, are very impactful to both the visitors and employees.
Mm-hmm. And I think opening dates are affected. I know oftentimes parks in the Southeast can open in the springtime. And recently, in the past few years, those opening dates have been pushed toward the summer because the HR process, the hiring process, is taking so long. And they're having to offer special incentives to get people to apply for jobs. And there may not be employees available to open campgrounds and picnic areas and visitor centers. And so any extension of that time, as Cheryl just mentioned, is really going to impact the operation of the park. And that spills over into the community as well.
I think in the last shutdown, hiring was definitely affected to a big degree. Parks did not get their list of candidates for jobs for weeks later than normal, and that really is a problem. And at most of the major national parks, another factor in visitation is that the season has expanded tremendously. We used to be able to hire school teachers to cover the seasonal interpretive education jobs, and that really doesn't work anymore because the season is so much longer than when the teachers are out of school. But it's true for other people as well. So the season at Acadia National Park is from April through early November now, rather than the summer months. And that's a challenge to get employees on quickly to fill the beginning of the season, but then to keep them on for the entire season.
Thanks. That's helpful.
Emily, I would just add, in my situation, my personal situation, I couldn't retire right away. I was going to retire in March of 2019. I had to wait 2 more months to retire in May of 2019 because of the shutdown, but that was okay.
Great. I'm gonna switch here to appropriations for a minute. So, we've seen some additional funding for the National Park Service recently, right, with the Great American Outdoors Act. And how is this kind of funding different than the kind of funding that we're talking about right now? So, if you were to say, like, as a response, sure, there's money, but what do we still need?
The Park Service has had a huge deferred maintenance program, a backlog of projects that needed to be accomplished. But the Congress did come through and they passed some great bills that have provided a lot of new money to address the deferred maintenance in parks with roads and buildings and structures and so forth. And all of those are being done pretty much by contract employees, although certainly employees are involved in some projects as well. But one of the things that, and I'm not sure I completely understand this, but it's almost impossible to get funding that continues, that's ongoing. It lasts from 1 year to the next, that permanent funding. And policies have said in the past that unless you have permanent funding, you can't hire permanent employees. And so that's important that we have that continuity from one generation to the next. The institutional memory, I think, is disappearing from the parks. I know, Sheridan, you and I have talked about this in the past, and institutional memory is really important. So we need ongoing, continuing appropriations. We appreciate and we're glad to see that special monies have been provided. Great America's Outdoor Act is an example, to address this backlog of deferred maintenance. And the backlog is huge still. And there's still a lot of discussion about what the numbers should be, but it is extensive. And so we need people to manage those projects, to prepare for those projects, to do the planning and the compliance and the engineering and so forth for those projects. And the regional offices have been decimated. Many of the regional offices are only half their size, and the Washington office has been cut tremendously. And they're always targeted first. When it's time to make cuts, they want to take care of the central offices and move the money from the central offices to the parks. We need both. We really need both. And so hopefully we can get this train on the right track and move forward.
Let me point out a couple things there, Phil. One, the smaller park units really depend on the regional offices for engineering and architectural and other kinds of support. They don't have that on their staff. Yellowstone and Grand Canyon probably has a park engineer and project management staff. Not so for the small parks. So that's where the regional offices really come in and play an important role. The other point I wanted to make was So to answer Emily's question, there's a difference between operating money and construction money and those kinds of things. So the special funding through the Great American Outdoors Act and other project funding is one-time money to those parks. And when it's gone, it's gone. Whereas operating money is an annual appropriation to the parks. And you can depend on that, at least to the extent that it's not going to be gone. It might be reduced in terms of its value because of inflation or because of a small budget cut. But the annual operating money is pretty stable, generally speaking, even though visitation, as I mentioned, is going way up. So I just wanted to draw the distinction between operating money and that special project money.
Sure. Good.
Thank you. We have a comment just that I wanted to share for everybody from one of our members in Alaska, that in Alaska, it's prime hunting season with more than 20 million acres open to hunting. The lack of law enforcement has a high potential to encourage some hunters to ignore the rules. The wildlife populations can suffer in a number of ways. Recovery from damage can be slow, and a shutdown is not a scenario that bodes well for Alaskan wildlife. And that's something we haven't gotten into too deeply here, but we've been talking about employees and certainly resource damage. But Cheryl, I think you mentioned hunting a little bit too, but certainly wildlife is also another casualty in this scenario.
Yeah, I could add to that. So bear management, it's a big issue in many national parks, and picking up garbage and making sure the dumpsters and trash cans are not overflowing is really important. Otherwise, you're attracting bears into the campgrounds and use areas. And once they become habituated to that kind of food source, it's really hard to discourage. So it's important part of a bear management program to regularly empty trash and keep things clean.
My first night in Yosemite, a bear came into my government quarters while I was asleep. And so I understand what you're saying there, Sheridan. I think also this question illustrates the diversity of our national parks. If you go to Washington, D.C., how are you going to close all the monuments, memorials in Washington, D.C. or San Francisco? The parks in the cities don't have gates. And the grounds are often open. I mean, there are just so many permutations of national parks. The one, as we always say, one size does not fit all in the National Park Service. And so everybody's got their own challenges that have to be addressed. And we're not trying to say, I know that we're not trying to say that our parks and our experiences represent the totality of the experience that's occurring out in our parks.
Yeah, absolutely. And this conversation is focused on the impact of a shutdown to parks. Obviously, a shutdown will impact everyone's lives in a multitude of ways, but our national parks are so loved and so visible that I think the impacts of a shutdown are often kind of the front lines of this situation. And so, it's something that it's painful. It's painful for everybody. I wanted to just ask your thoughts on advocacy in general. The coalition will stay engaged with our partners. We'll continue to join letters. We'll continue to reach out to our congressional contacts and urge them to pass a CR to avert a government shutdown. Is there advice for members who want to get involved and who want to help? I'm thinking like reaching out to your representatives is a good course of action right now to urge a CR, but also just to support funding for parks and public lands. But if you have any thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Well, the proposed budget from the House of Representatives for the National Park Service is a huge cut. I read $266 million cut, but I also saw a number that was higher than that. But in any case, it's a significant cut in operating funding. And again, it's the operating funding. And that's a direct impact to parks. It would mean fewer employees, probably fewer seasonals. And again, with the workload increasing, it's going to be a big hit. to all the park units to take a cut like that. I think that's an 8% cut. And at Rocky Mountain National Park, 10% of our budget went to seasonal employees. You could lose your entire seasonal workforce. Anyway, it's so just at least maintaining last year's budget is really important in my opinion. And so if people are going to contact their representatives, certainly a continuing resolution is important, but also maintaining at least last year's operating budgets for the national parks would be equally important in my opinion.
I would just comment too, just that continued advocacy, and I think the coalition is here to hopefully support all of our national parks and have in the past, and will continue to do so. So whatever way our members can reach out to their delegation, I think will be really helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they certainly respond to those individual letters, I think, even more than to sign-on letters where there's organizations. When they get a personal letter from someone, I think that really helps a lot.
Great. Well, does anybody have any last thoughts to share? Parting words of wisdom? All good.
We've got to get the staffing back to a reasonable level, which means we have to get the budgets to a more reasonable level, the appropriations. And it's going to take a lot of work. And so members of the coalition can really play an important role by helping us contact Congress and making a pitch. The beauty of being retired is that we don't have to worry about our next job assignment, where it's going to be, and we don't have to worry about what the directions are coming from Washington, D.C. We can tell it like it is.
Absolutely. Well, your voices of experience are so important in this. We have a great membership with an incredible amount of wisdom and experience that comes in handy in these situations. So I'm going to pull up one last comment here and then we'll wrap this up. Is there clear guidance on whether a shutdown means parks must close gates and roads versus facilities they operate?
Not yet.
Tricky question.
Yeah.
You're waiting.
Yeah.
Stay tuned.
Yes, right.
Yeah. Well, we will continue to stay engaged. We will continue to remain advocates for parks and public lands. Thank you, Phil and Cheryl and Sheridan, for joining the conversation today. Thanks to the members and friends and partners who have joined us for this. And we'll keep on it.
And thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.